So, yeah.
So Bill, after a long career as a venture capitalist, you clearly are an expert at sizing up the ecosystems of various industries. So tell us a little bit about how you see the landscape of the wine industry in Napa today, and the way in which this panel, in fact, captures some of that diversity.
Okay. Well, if you know anything about the wine business, you know there are many different sizes and shapes and product strategies and corporate structures. But I think the three of us really do represent some very important segments of the industry. And so when I was asked to suggest what sort of panel we might put together, I really wanted to see each of them represented. Just very quickly, the areas that you see represented here, of course, are, in David's case, the large, vertically integrated, high-end premium winery. And let me emphasize, I'm only talking about the production structure of the business. Because if we were to start to get into the marketing structure of the business with the distributors and the retail stores and the restaurants and the critics and all those other factors, we don't have enough time. I mean, we're giving you a taste.
Well, the way we're feeding people, they may stay around.
But anyway, so David represents the larger, not necessarily as large as some of the operations here. Not that large. Maybe I didn't even ask you how many cases you produce. Bob represents the winery that evolved from a small family operation to a small to medium sized, still family run, partially integrated. And what I mean by partially integrated, where David sources probably 98%, I think, of the fruit that he needs for his wine, Bob only owns a smaller percent, but he has long-standing, as typical of this industry, he has long-standing relationships with independent growers. Now, I'm here because I'm one of those independent growers. And I'm one of the later generation of independent growers, derisively known as gentleman farmers. Because most of the independent growers, even still, especially I think that Bob deals with, are old families that have been growing, farming grapes, growing wine for many, many years. And while Bob has little one-page contracts that we sign every few years, it's really the handshakes that are still the important thing in this business, especially in the segment of the business that Bob is still in and hopefully can remain in for a long time. So that's an overall structure. I'd say the one major segment that's missing, in recent years, the large grower has emerged. We didn't have that before. That has consolidated many small vineyards into larger vineyards, and that's become a very important factor in the industry.
For the good or for ill?
Well, it depends on whether you're a winemaker or a grower. It certainly, it evolved because the corporations, Hubline, that David will probably mention he was with, the larger companies came in, bought a lot of wineries, and then had difficulty protecting their source of grapes. So they bought a lot of vineyards. And then they found that the farming business really wasn't a business they wanted to be in because there were labor issues and other issues that were hurting their public image. And so they decided to divest. And the fellow who got Hubline into a lot of these vineyards decided to give them an easy track to divest and managed to purchase many of those vineyards and form his own independent company. The change that took place was, up to then, the growers looked at their checkbook at the beginning of the year, looked at their checkbook at the end of the year, and if the the bank balance was a little bit higher than it had been, they considered it a successful year. When Andy Beckstoffer came in, I think he really brought a lot of clout to the supply side of the grape business, and was able to really give the growers a stronger say in what was going on here.
Okay.
Can I jump in just?
Yeah, but
Just
first
first.
let me give you a question.
Oh, okay.
But you can jump in at any time. But I want to plant my little question. Tell us about your journey from engineering to winemaking. But jump in.
Okay, while we're still on growers, we grew up, I grew up as a longtime standing family that grew grapes since the 30s, right? And honestly, in those days, Napa was really not what we think of Napa, the glamorous Napa, as it is today. And growers were really not able to make a living. As a matter of fact, we were mostly, as Bill mentioned, mostly small families that put together these little farms and sold their grapes to other wineries. And more often than not, those families were really not making much of a living on that product. That's just the way it was. And it wasn't until, at first, it wasn't until Robert Mondavi in Opus 1, in 1966, when Robert Mondavi built that winery, I remember my dad saying, like, who in the heck is this guy? He just didn't build a little winery, he built a complex. And more importantly, my dad was saying, what does he see that we don't see? What's going on here? And that complete confidence that Napa can become something and do something. And of course, 76, the Judgment of Paris, it all unveiled itself and unfolded. And that's when, a little later on in the 80s, when Andy Beckstoffer came along, and he had that confidence as a grower, and he saw what was happening. And as much as possibly now I may disagree with some of his philosophies and whatnot, what he did for a grower at the time was honor our tradition and our input into this whole business, and actually allow a family to make a living. So it wasn't taken for granted, and so I really credit those two people for really bumping the industry.
So we'll get back to, I get to jump in now. Because the question about your journey, I want to hear it too. And it's going to be slightly self-serving, but I'll avoid that. To talk about Robert Mondavi as an individual, obviously, before I worked for Opus 1, I worked for Robert Mondavi for 7 years. And then before that, I worked for Rothschild. But I think the point that we'd like to bring up historically when I think about the individual Robert Mondavi, what he saw was an important distinction between the product and how the product is used. Yeah. He understood the lifestyle value. And what I tell people is that when he started his winery, the reason he became the great spokesperson for Napa Valley was because he didn't go around the country saying, here's my wine, taste it, do you like it, here's the price. I mean, that's fine, but that's not what he did. He was like Julia Child. He went around the country and he shared with us his understanding of the role that wine could and should play in our lives. The historical role, the cultural role, the joy of living together with food and bread and sharing stories, and that wine was indispensable to that. And he did it in a way that when he told you, you were like, I want to live that life. I met so many people who said they spent a weekend with Robert and Margaret and their values were changed. So he said, this is what matters. Why does wine matter? Not because we can make money on it, but because it improves the quality of our life, the experience. And then he said that he came from this place that many people hadn't heard from called Napa Valley. And he said, one day this will be known as one of the world's great wine growing regions because of the bay, because of the beauty, because of this. And then he said, oh yeah, I make a wine there too. And this intentional soft sell made him this spokesperson, and he wasn't alone, but who awoke Napa Valley. And I think the distinction between the technical aspects of how we grow grapes, how we make wines, and the chemistry is all critical. But at the end of the day, what matters is what we do with it and why we care and why it improves the quality of our lives. And that's something we're still building.
Well, here's an interesting point, so I'm going to jump in.
You can.
Because essentially what you've articulated is something that now people write business review articles. So, you know, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review where two professors at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern held up the wine industry as a model for other businesses, and that their argument was that winemakers succeed by educating consumers, conveying their vision, and you talked about articulating a lifestyle, and influencing tastes rather than simply giving consumers what they already want or think that they want. So you've kind of told us that.
I think that's fair, and what I love, to be gratuitous and honest, what you're doing and what RPI is doing, the intersection of art and science is key, is critical, understanding that, it's complex, and this is what's happening with wine, the art of wine. So, you know, it's a complex noise of people who write about wine, who affect opinion. Robert Parker's now retired, but for years people said that his singular opinion was creating styles in our business, and I think that's not incorrect. We do by going out and presenting our wines, explaining them, talking about them, getting people connected to the ideas. And consumers have their own tastes that we follow. And so it's this mixture that, that may be illustrative and may be interesting to learn from.
That's interesting, to understand taste and use it then to create a market. But I think it would be interesting, Bob and David, for people to have an understanding of, just briefly, your journeys from where you started to where you are. And I know you have these deep family roots, but it's interesting that you started in engineering.
Right. Well, I guess we all grow up in having some sort of interest in what we think we want to do, and I'm kind of built that way. I mean, engineering-wise, I kind of think that way. Meticulous little things and whatnot, detail, which is good. I mean, the wine industry is full of details, just like any industry, right? But in any case, moving into that journey, into that education, I found that I was okay at engineering, but I wasn't ever going to be the best, and that kind of bothered me in the sense that if I'm going to design and build a bridge, I don't want that thing to fall down, you know? And so that whole concept started to really gnaw at me, and at the same time, my own fervor for my faith was growing at the same time, and it became overwhelming in me. And as a matter of fact, I took a break, and I was mentioning, and I went to Papua New Guinea and lived with Franciscan friars and Swiss nuns for 3 years. And it was a great experience, obviously one that I would never forget, and it helped shape me. But in any case, I came back, and at some point I realized, and I did finish my education and all that, which made my parents happy. But I did realize that, for crying out loud, my father owns a vineyard in Napa Valley, and what a gift is that? And so he had always wanted somebody to step up and continue the tradition, and I saw it coming in our little system that in order to, beyond what Andy was doing for the growers, really to move forward in a small way. I mean, unless you have 100 or 1,000 acres, okay, that's one thing, but we don't. That's all there is to it. The way to move ahead is to go to the next level and become a producer. And I knew that was my father's dream, and his dream became my dream, and it just kind of started. And in the meantime, I had reconnected with a childhood friend who now is a business partner, and he's the marketing and the sales end of it. I've known him since 4th grade, Dave Pramack. And so as a team, we did very well. And it's a simple journey. I mean, like everyone's journey. I mean, but that's where I ended up. my grandparents landed here, and I finally woke up and realized that, and took advantage of it.
David?
People ask that question often. There was no reason that I should have ended up in the wine business. My parents, my family, there was no connection. I usually say my last name was not Mondavi or Gal or Sebastiani. There was no connection. And I graduated and applied to a school called UC Davis as a place to go. I wasn't aimless, but I had no aim. I got better. And my brother, older brother, smarter than I am, was at Stanford pre-med, and he and I spent 2 months in Europe with a backpack, sleeping on the sidewalks and the Euro train. It was a great 2 months. We started in France, and through a connection, we're at a producer in Burgundy, Nuit Saint-Georges. And we spent about 2 weeks putting capsules on the top of bottles, sort of like Laverne and Shirley. And in the middle of that experience, the workers in the cellar asked the two of us what we'd be doing in the future. My brother said he'd be a doctor, which he is. And I said, I don't know, I'm going to UC Davis and maybe political science. And they got excited and said, you're going to be in the wine business. I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. Do the 2 months, go back to UC Davis. We're sitting there looking through the majors book and open up to fermentation science. I thought it was a joke. Who does this? I was like, look, here it is. That's what they talked about. And this gives you insight to my personality. My decision was, it's a 4-year program, undergraduate, 4 years. The first 2 years are all, core sciences, physics, bacteriology, before you do any wine. I said, as a lark, as a hoot, I'm going to pretend to be a winemaker and, sign up for this crazy program. And then in my 3rd year, I'll do something responsible. That was my plan. And so I did that. And then this owner of this winery in Burgundy, a gentleman named Armand Cotin, he's still alive, owned a property called La Bourgeois. Anyway, he writes a letter and says, would I set up a tour with the professors at Davis for him and his winemaker? Well, as a freshman, that's sort of cool. So I go see the professors and say, well, my Burgundian friend wants to come over. And they were excited, the professors. And so the day comes, they arrive over, and true to their word, the professors give a beautiful presentation of everything they're doing, and I'm on the tour with them. At the end of this experience, the Frenchman calls me over to the side, and he says, all of that stuff is worthless. It's a waste of time. It's a true story. He said, if you want to be an expert in wine, you taste 500 wines. True story. You tell a college kid to taste 500 wines, it's like, I'm on it. And he said, when you get your diploma, let me know. And he goes, I'll bring you to France to teach you French winemaking. Oh. So I stick that in my pocket. And when I get to the 3rd year, I start the wine classes. I loved biochemical pathways, but I started the wine classes, and I really loved applying the science to the product. And this gentleman, Armand Cotin, had been the first one to show me what is the essential characteristic of our industry, which is conviviality, warmth, friendship, sharing. And this man embodied that. So I kept doing the program, and I graduated, and 1 month after graduating, he took me to France. And I lived in France for a year, working in the cellars, doing whatever kind of work I had to do. And that was the start of it. I've not looked back.
So is the wine business, is it winemaking an art, a science, or culture?
Oh, all those. But before we, because that's the lovely question, but just to finish the epilogue to the story, this gentleman, Armand Cotin, this was 1984 and 85, had a brother, he's now passed away. His brother's name was Philippe Cotin. This is the great irony and destiny of my life. Philippe Cotin was none other than the right-hand man of Baron Philippe de Rothschild at Chateaumoult-on-Rothschild. And when we talk about Baron Philippe de Rothschild and Robert Mondavi meeting to create Opus One, the man behind the men who made that happen was Philippe Cotin. Mm-hmm. So the family that got me into wine was the family that was responsible for making Opus One. That's interesting. And I met Philippe Cotin in 1985 when I was a young little intern out of UC Davis, and we kept connections all the way through our lives. And then in 2004, when I became named CEO of Opus One, I was in Bordeaux, went to his house for dinner, and the two of us just sat looking at each other like this. But the best part is he looked at me and he said, "Don't fuck it up." Sorry for all of you. But I looked at him as seriously as I could because I knew what he meant. And I said, I won't. Okay. I won't. Now, what was the question? Sorry.
You've already answered it. So Bill, here you are, classic, what people have talked about in, the last 20, 30 years, classic successful venture capitalists. And so, you have the whole Silicon Valley phenomenon. So what can winemakers learn from Silicon Valley, from startups, but then what can Silicon Valley learn from the wine business?
Wow.
Well, you know how it goes. Give the man his time now.
You can go back to the notion of the blending of art and science.
Okay.
In Silicon Valley, sometimes there's too much of an emphasis on what you can achieve through science and engineering. And if you look at the real successful companies, the vision, which isn't really as much a scientific phenomenon as a creative, cultural phenomenon, to understand how the science and the advances in science are going to create big opportunities it's very important. Too many people in Silicon Valley need to understand that, or they do, because they come to understand it because they're exposed to so many successful entrepreneurial ventures. And here, I think a lot of the early people in this business were just following a random path. I mean, they had a relationship with the land and with the product, but they really didn't have much of a vision of where they were going to take it. And even though they perfected a lot of techniques for farming and winemaking and learned a lot each year, they really didn't combine it with the creative side and take it forward. So I think there's that. I really, the notion of a big element of science, I guess there are different people in the business who have different theories about this. But when you're out there in the vineyard at the mercy of nature, you realize that your job isn't to substitute the element of nature that is so important in the creation of the wine. But your job is to make the right choices in the beginning, match the terroir to the varietal that you're going to grow, figure out how you're going to lay out the vineyard. I have a list here just in case you want to be bored to death of probably 50 variables that you have to be dealing with at the beginning. And how do you know? How do you learn these things? Well, this is, as has been pointed out by my colleagues, a very collegial industry. And there are people who are eager to help you, some of whom you hire to help you, and some of whom just will, we had a problem of nematodes in the soil, worms, too high a count of nematodes in the soil. And why is that bad? Because they are a vector for certain viruses that can affect the vines. Now, we wanted to try to find an organic solution. We didn't just want to nuke them because we knew you couldn't just nuke them without nuking a lot of the good organisms that exist in that soil. And I started making some inquiries, and sure enough, somebody said, why don't you call Bartolucci, who had a vineyard near mine, because he used to have as his consultant on farming, Michael Opatz, who is an expert on, you know the name, most people in the industry do, who was an expert on dealing with these kinds of problems. And sure enough, the guy came and shared the entire protocol with us. And, it was a little bit complex, but it all involved very careful application of organic materials. And sure enough, it worked.
So do you think that advances in the life sciences, in genomics, in biotechnology, have a role in this business?
You
Well, I only
directed
ask
this to me.
softball questions.
I'm the management engineer, you know.
You're begging off.
So when I was living in France, the French are, just thoroughly opposed to any genetically modified organisms, any products or objects, and they will literally go into research vineyards and pull out vines that have been genetically modified to try and before even looking at the results. It's a complicated question because we have certain diseases that kill vines for which we have no response as of this time. And there's one called Pearson's disease, which is carried by sharpshooters, which the only way to protect the vine is to keep the vector, which is the sharpshooters, out of the vineyard. And as Bill was saying, sort of spot spraying for that is complicated. So philosophically, if we could have a genetically modified vine was such that it was resistant to this disease, that would be a good thing.
However,
but how the market would receive it, or scientific questions which are associated with genetically modified objects and products being such as they are, leave it an open question. Because at this point, I think there was the University of Florida who was getting close to having vines that were showing characteristics of being able to be resistant to phylloxera, Pearson's disease, but it's not on the market yet. So the question isn't upon us yet. So I don't have an answer.
But you have to be very careful, if I may just interject quickly.
Sure.
There was a time when everybody in here in this valley grasped on a new rootstock that seemed to be resistant to a lot of issues, and it was called AXR. And it had been developed, I believe, up at Davis.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a historic problem in this industry called phylloxera. A lot of people have heard about it. It's a root louse that over a period of time destroys the plant and certainly gradually reduces its productivity and its quality. And they forgot to check whether, because they hadn't seen that disease in years, and they forgot to test whether this new rootstock would be susceptible to this. And the bottom line is that practically the entire wine industry, over a period of 10 years or more, had to replant everything that they had in order to deal with this phylloxera problem. So you got to watch out in dealing with Mother Nature.
So what I end up saying is nature abhors monocultures.
Right.
Nature will find a way to get in and attack monocultures. And so diversity, genetic diversity, is related to sustainability. And we're learning that in a way. It's right. It's not taking one answer and having this answer for everybody. So as we replant our vineyard at Opus 1, we're increasing the number of rootstocks and clonal selections to have a greater genetic diversity. It is necessarily a monoculture because it's all grapes. But within that, we can have as much diversity as possible.
Well, please. Bob.
just on that, the whole thing with climate change, okay, regardless of what how we feel about that, things are getting warmer, even here in Napa, right? And on this whole monoculture of, even though it's grapes, we can have diversity within our grapes. And so what's really interesting, I find it really fascinating, kind of ironic, is that what people are moving towards, not moving towards, but they're experimenting with other varieties to help kind of offset this. For example, in St. Helena, where it's kind of warm, right next to Bill is Spotswood, as he mentioned. Spotswood is a very old winery, and what they're doing is reintroducing varieties that we used to grow here, including Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, Charbonneau, a couple of others that they feel are could be good candidates as the temperature rises even more so in St. Helena. And I just find it ironic is that Napa was completely planted with all of these varieties in the past, and now we've gone so far heavily into the monoculture of the Bordeaux varieties that God knows Bordeaux varieties do very well here, and it has lifted the boat of Napa, so thank you. but it kind of came at a little bit of a sacrifice, I feel. It kind of removed some of these beautiful varieties that now we're finding really do well in Napa, and in the future could probably help save some of what we're struggling with. So I just think it's ironic, but I'm grateful that maybe some of this monoculture of varieties is going to be slightly broken up.
Well, obviously our hearts go out to everyone here in California that, have been displaced by this recent rounds of fires with the increasing ferocity, and it's indicative of something. People always, I'm a scientist, so I certainly do think the climate is changing, but...
So you don't think it's a rake problem? Sorry, that's politics.
In Europe...
Sorry.
In Europe, the producers in France and Italy, in fact, are also experimenting with more heat-tolerant varieties of grapes, and even the Scandinavian countries are beginning to invest in their own fledgling wine industries. And so people are making these adjustments, and I've always found it interesting when people talk about genetic modification, of crops and organisms. And if you think about crossbreeding of any kind, you're really doing a genetic modification. It's just at what level do you really understand what's going on? Right. Is it down to the molecular level or not? So it's interesting. And so what about other technologies like blockchain?
Like what?
Blockchain, AI,
managing
and data analytics. Do they have any role here? These people think about blockchain from the point of view of, getting more confidence in your supply chain, even the provenance, even in the agricultural business.
So I know it's been proposed to us. We have an active counterfeiting challenge. Right. And so we've used some NFC, the RFID technology. Every one of our bottles has got an NFC chip behind the back label, which when we scan it with a phone allows us to geolocate the bottle. And we've got some ink in our capsule, which changes color if you look at it through polarized lens. And those two have given us quite effective protection against counterfeiting in a way. And blockchain has been presented to us, but I've not spent time investigating it. So I think it's just on the early stages, but I think there really is an opportunity because traceability and assurance of quality of product from tank to bottle really matters. And we don't have, as an industry, sufficient protection, in my opinion, at this point.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Bob?
Well, from a vineyard perspective, technology, from growers that have hundreds and possibly even thousands of acres, they do benefit from some of the technology emerging technology that's come, especially with drones and whatnot. Grape growing it's a fruit, and you need to stay on top of it. Things can happen. They can happen overnight. They can happen in a week, and you didn't know about it. And you have to react in a certain way, in a certain manner, at a certain time. And you can only have so many people walking so many vineyards. And if a company has that many vineyards, these technologies are, from what I can understand and see, are very, very helpful, and they're really they're dialing all that in. From our perspective, we are still small enough that I and others still walk the vineyards, and I see that problem. Our growers are walking their vineyards, and they see the problem right away. And so from our little viewpoint, we're still doing it the old way, and we're on top of it. One thing that we have embraced, though, is soil sensors for water, for irrigation. I mentioned that most of what we do is dry farmed, and it really is my preferred method because these vineyards are just so dialed in. However, in some of these newer plantings and blocks, we've incorporated soil sensors from 1 foot to like 7 feet, and we can determine really very, very well what exactly is going on in the uptake of water into that vine and what is it really calling for in different parts of the vineyard. So we can really manage that water usage. And water, like everywhere, is always very important. And people that don't think it is, they're always wrong. It's just as simple as that. Water is very important. And as a matter of fact, we're actually, when we're redoing our blocks, our vineyard blocks, we're incorporating rootstocks that are more drought resistant so that our, even though we do have to water them, they are less so. And with the soil sensors, we're watering them at a more timely manner that we can actually tell. We can see it coming, for example, Of course, people like me who walk vineyards all the time kind of see it coming anyway. You notice the signs. It's like your child. Honestly, if your child is grumpy at dinner, well, he was grumpy at school. He was grumpy at dinner. There's something wrong. And grapes are the same way. If they're grumpy looking, there's something wrong. So, even from a small grower to a larger grower, these technologies are emerging and they're actually helpful. So,
Bill?
Can I say a story real quickly? Because I love the grumpy grapes. This issue of being a reductionist or holistic about things, breaking it down to the littlest compounds, or understanding soil as a series of elements and minerals in soil versus an understanding of the soil, and walking and feeling is really a big deal. And my first experience was this when I came out of UC Davis, very much in the scientific, break it down to the smallest article and understanding formulations about soil. To me, soil was a mixture of how many elements and minerals. And I went to France and I started reading a French viticulture book, and they had soil described by faces, smiling, grumpy, or otherwise. And I thought, what is this? This is for children. But that's what you learn after a while. You start to feel things and understand the personality, understand the sense of it. And science has got a great role to inform and elucidate and lead us places. But I haven't found that it replaces the sense of understanding and feeling that is necessary to grow grapes and make wine.
well
Bill?
said.
But just a little perspective that we were discussing earlier. You have to realize we here are in the premium wine business. The Napa Valley represents 4% of the wine grape production in the state of California. So we are small potatoes, and the premium segment of Napa Valley grape growing, which has become a pretty large segment, but it's not 100%, so you're even down to a lower percentage represented here. My point is, it's a matter of scale, which there was some reference to. I spent 30 years, as some of you know, on the board of Trimble, and was kind of a founding investor. And Trimble is a dominant force in agriculture these days because of their ability to apply precise positioning to concepts like prescription farming that allow you to treat a farm in 10 square meter segments and change on the fly your application of chemicals and fertilizers and water and everything else just dynamically. And that's been a huge factor in improving the productivity of large-scale farming. When I've tried to take some of those notions into the vineyard, you just can't justify them. I mean, it's just it's just the scale. Now, you go out in the Central Valley to Home Ranch and some of those operations that have thousands of acres of grapes. You better believe they do that, and they do automated, harvesting machines and all the kinds of things that you will rarely, if ever, find here in the valley. Everything's still done by hand because those little grapes are pretty sensitive.
But it's interesting,
assets.
though, if you do have the sensors in the ground,
Right.
and you're doing it to detect the moisture and so forth, in many ways you're collecting an enormous amount of data.
Right.
And there are techniques with data analytics and so on that can give you some insights. It's not going to answer all the questions, and it doesn't necessarily get you down to the molecular level, but it can kind of bring that feeling piece together with a more directed understanding of what might be going on. So I just think it's going to be interesting to watch as the years go on how this plays out. And we have a big project at Rensselaer with the freshwater systems and how you preserve them. And, you know, we put 50 different sensor platforms in and around this lake in upstate New York, Lake George. And so we collect enormous amounts of streaming data. We've done LiDAR imaging and things like that. And things are not all modeled down to the very molecular level, but we are beginning to develop more understanding about, you know, what salt might do, what other things. And one of the things people found out is that salt actually changes the sex of certain of the living creatures in the water, which affects their reproduction. So all of these things come into play, and maybe it's the focus on the stressors that might be where it's interesting, as opposed to, you know, the things that you kind of do on the really creative side.
So,
Yes, please.
many people will say, and I agree, that the French have a term called terroir, which is the expression of the site. Terroir is 80% the soil's, the water holding capacity. 80% of terroir expression is how the soil holds the water. So it's all about that. And all that we've said, I think, is relative. What I find fascinating is that empirically, through our experience, we say that this site gives grapes that have more of a minerality character, and this site gives it grapes with a different, and it's because of the minerals in the soil. Science has been unable to tell us how the roots of vines actually interact with these minerals. There is no knowledge as to how the roots and the minerals interact.
Well, I would argue that it's because people haven't chosen to really focus on it.
You're right, and they haven't collected, they haven't bothered to collect the data. It's really interesting. Every year, one of the big variables in growing premium grapes is how much fruit do you drop? A vine can only support a certain amount of fruit, and usually vines end up producing more than they can support. So you got to come through, and I won't go through the details, but you got to decide what you're going to drop and just let go, so that the rest will develop properly. Bob Biale is the main guy who makes that call. Even though we farm our vineyard, we rely on the expertise of the winery that takes our grapes to come in and tell us what they think we should be doing in that regard. We've done it differently from year to year, although we've found some patterns that work, but we really haven't even taken the time to log those decisions and try to correlate them to the outcome in terms of some measure of the quality of the wine that came, or the yield, or whatever that came that year. We don't do that because Bob has his own computer that he walks around with, and he internalizes the knowledge that he learns visiting many different vineyards. But Bob's not going to be here forever. And so the practices that were dependent on experience, you know, now have to be systematized in a way that you can bring along a new generation of people. And I think that's a little more fundamental than getting into some of the really sophisticated data keeping. But I think we need to do a lot more of that.
I agree, and that's why you can never substitute walking a vineyard with machinery.
Totally.
And I think that's common sense, right? You can't, like when you're growing your garden, well, you better be looking in your garden. You better know what's ripe and whatnot.
But that's data too, you see,
Yeah,
what you're gathering. And so I think that plays into what you're talking about. So Bob, let me ask you this. You know, with the consolidation of distributors, you know, many family wineries struggle sometimes to reach new markets, particularly given there's a patchwork quilt of regulations that in the past has limited direct-to-consumer shipments. So how important, if it is at all, is e-commerce to what you do?
It's e-commerce. E-commerce itself plays a little smaller role than, I mean, are you talking about actually people just going online and making a purchase?
I'll let you define it.
Okay, well, that's a tool, and it's a good one to have these days. But I think it's for people who are kind of in a rush and they maybe just don't want to make that connection or whatnot. And it remains still kind of a smaller segment for us. For some reason, what we actually get is more phone calls. It's really interesting. People love to call and talk about wine. And they want somebody to just like sit there in their ear and talk. And it's just like, tell me about that wine. Tell me about that. And they'll just sit there, and we have a term for it, but I won't say what it is. I should, because it's really good. But
It's okay. We hear it enough in hockey games or something.
It's his spiritual background.
Yes, exactly.
But people, it's a quality. Wine is just not something that is so limited to hardcore little things. They want to feel it. It's an emotion that they get when they call somebody, and they want vicariously living through. They want to be a part of Napa. They want to be something, and so we supply that, and we're happy to do that, and so that segment is much larger for us, and I love it. And I understand it. So
Well, you know, we have one of the best, pretty strong business analytics program. And we have a professor, his name is Hekam Moglu, who, in our management school, who specializes in quote unquote fine wine analytics. And he uses analytics to develop pricing models for wine futures and to show how distributors in Bordeaux can optimize their profits with investments in wine futures. So, but it doesn't seem to be something that Napa Valley premium winemakers have embraced. And in some ways, people think of it as an old world idea of selling futures as a hedge against price swings. So what do you all have to say about that?
I can speak a little bit to that, or quite a bit to that. So in Bordeaux, for the world's greatest wines from Bordeaux and many of the Bordelais wines, they have this unique system, which is unique to Bordeaux, of selling in futures 2 years before the wine is released. The chateaus will sell to a middleman called negociants, who will then buy these wines pre-release and sell them forward. And the logic has been historically that these wines are released at a lower price than you will have to pay 2 years later. But you're betting on the market, and you're betting on these wines and the scores that somebody might give to these wines 2 years later. And many of these analyses, particularly in recent years, have shown this simply not to be true, in that people are buying wines 2 years before they take ownership at a very high price. It becomes a kind of a stock market. Speculation goes crazy, and people pay high prices, and then 3, 4, 5 years later, these same wines are available down at the store at a third of the price. And so this system basically is just getting cash into the chateau owners' pockets 2 years early, and they like it. There's very little incentive for other regions and value. What it tends to happen is it's a kind of amplifier. In great vintages, for whoever decides that, the prices accelerate too high. And in low vintages, they go too low. And you get this swing back and forth, which creates for Bordeaux a drama and a theater, which effectively brings the whole wine world to their doorsteps, which has got value. But we're seeing some erosion in that. Some of the wineries, famously Chateau Latour, has decided not to sell futures anymore. And they're only releasing deliverable cases at this price that the market then either accepts or doesn't. So it is of great interest. If someone can create a model, as one might with the stock market, that could predict future value and prices, that would be pretty interesting. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that we're going to see other wine regions moving towards it, because it's too speculative, and nobody around the world is going to give people from Napa their money 2 years in advance.
Right. There was someone, and I read an article about this several years ago, and you'd probably know more about this, David, who had been able to do a chemical analysis of wines and predict the scores that they would get in subsequent years. Now that's, on its surface, a very powerful tool, and he also was working on how to modify the chemical composition to increase the probability of the score. And a lot of people got interested in it, except the people who've been in the business for a long time, who just sort of looked at it and said, well, that's amusing. We'll see if how much money people are going to waste on this before they realize what's more common.
I'm not aware of any models that can can predict human behavior, human preferences. You can take historical data and create models which sort of look backwards and model pretty closely. And it's sort of like modeling weather. We can model climate over 500, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 years, and our models are good looking backwards. But going forward, when you try and model the weather 2 weeks from now, we're not very good at it.
Well, it's an issue of the physics and the computational capabilities.
Those two things.
So,
right.
So I think we
human,
can talk.
human behavior is hard.
Well, people are getting better at it. Not all aspects of human behavior, but so we're going to give the audience a chance to ask just a couple of questions. We don't want to keep you here all afternoon, although I could sit here all afternoon. But is there one thing in your Rensselaer education, I'm asking the two alums, that you found to be useful to you, but in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah.
For what you do.
So I received an MBA on international business through Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute at the University of Hartford. And it was a milestone turning point in my life, in my career. And the value of education, both sort of personally and becoming a professional and growing into something new, is invaluable. I started as a winemaker. I was a technical guy, and I hated sales and marketing. And I loved winemaking, and I wanted to get into management. And I knew that the only way I could get into management is if I understood, to some degree, if one can, sales and marketing. And to understand sales and marketing, I needed an MBA. And the access to a 2-year program while I was working in Hartford was just exactly what I needed. And it was a robust, challenging, thorough MBA program that I've used for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
My son studied engineering at another distinguished Eastern institution, and his first job was as an engineer, and the first thing he said, he called me and he said, this is frightening, I don't know how to do any of this stuff. And I said to him, no engineering student walks into his first job and knows how to do what they're supposed to do. You have a toolkit that you've learned on how to use tools, how to quickly learn how to analyze something. And that's what you've developed, is that skill. Now, when you move on to a business education, you refine your analytical skills, but more importantly, you refine your skills at synthesis. You refine the skills at seeing patterns.
Right.
And learning how those patterns react to different variables over a period of time. And so it's really hard to quantify it, but I think all of us have seen that when we get into real world practical problems, we suddenly realize, yes, we are prepared. We just have to learn the nature of this problem and the processes that they're using to solve it. But we really are more prepared than we think we are when we first walk into that job. And I'd say that's been true of everything in my life, whether it's, I produce jazz concerts now as a sidelight. I have a lot of fun doing it. And it's a not-for-profit, but it's a business. It has to survive. And it's the same skill set. I mean, you've learned.
So is there a question from any of you? I would ask that you stand. I was going to say we have limited vision, but I think up here we have great vision, but perhaps limited sight. So, Curtis.
A few years ago, you had a devastating fire occur. But in the press,
Why don't you take the mic? I think
So 2 years ago, you had a devastating fire up here, and we heard all about it in the press, but we haven't heard anything since then of the recovery, what you've learned. And I'm actually more after, what did you learn that you didn't expect, or just like, oh no, I never comprehended that something like that would be an outcome of the fire?
I'll tell you, the main one was a tremendous fall off in tourism because people suddenly became frightened of the wine country because they had all these devastating fires. When in fact, right here in the valley, it never really got to the valley floor. It got to some of the edges of the valley floor, but it burned in the hills around us. And frankly, the vineyards proved to be quite an effective buffer because they have some moisture and they also don't have the density of fuel that is required.
So it's funny because I thought Bill would talk about the effect of the smoke on the grapes, and I would talk about sort of the market.
I'm an old marketing guy.
So we'll flip it. The interesting thing is we're having more fires in Australia or Oregon or here, and when grapes are exposed to smoke, there can be a thing that we refer to as smoke taint that can be captured by the grapes and then go into the wine. The chemistry of that is very poorly understood. The experience is known in that wind and 4-ethylguaiacol, 4-methylguaiacol are the markers for smoke taint. So we can measure this in the wine, in the juice, in the wine, and we think we know where the sensory threshold is for perception. It's complicated because initially you can't smell it at all. It's insidious this way because 9-10 months later it can bloom on you. So if you blend these lots into your wine too soon, you can end up in smoke taint. You can think, well, it smells like a fireplace or something. Smoke taint is like an old wet ashtray. It's not nice, and it doesn't help at all. So the curiosity is how do you study it? And the problem is, and happily, we don't have fires every year because one particular year is different from the next. And the experience of one varietal to another varietal are very difficult to compare. And there was great excitement in the face of such catastrophe in 17 because UC Davis has got research vineyards in Oakville here in Napa. And they have side-by-side parcels where they actually harvested one of this side of the vineyard before the fire and the other after. So they had a before and after, and you could then go at it and see what the difference is and track it. And they were so excited to do this research. Challenge is that's just 1 year, and you need a bigger database than 1 year to do it. And it didn't happen the next year, and isn't the same. So we have the empirical reality of dealing with smoke and smoke taint, and then science could help us understand the pathway.
Right. Two practical things we've learned is everyone needs a generator. That's all there is to it. So you can invest in generators. That's going to be a great business, let me tell you. Wineries and homes. The other thing, on a firefighting side, what they learned in Sonoma was people, the regular people, learned to listen to the warnings, heed the warning early, and leave so that the firefighters can do their job and not waste time trying to save people, which happened and occurred in Napa at the time. And the firefighting technique that they used in Sonoma really was quick and efficient, and they drew big lines in the sand and said, this is where it's going to stop. And they were able to employ tons of labor at that, and it was very, very effective. And unfortunately, those aren't the stories that the media is telling. They're telling all these other things, which are keeping people away. But that fire in Sonoma could have been tremendously worse if the firefighting techniques weren't employed and people had not left. But anyway,
So it
yeah.
leads to more faster and more effective firefighting.
Right.
Especially if you get the
amazing.
people out of it.
Right. So tourism, firefighting, and this smoke taint. One last question. Oh, there's a lot of hands. Yes, please. No, the gentleman in the red.
Okay. Yeah, being from RPI and engineering school, one of the advances that's really taking hold in many industries is machine learning. And my area, medical imaging, it's started to make an impact. They're a little bit slower because doctors are very proud and think I can look at my patient, my data, and make resolution. But now with more and more big data out there, machine learning's coming in, making more of an impact. I'm wondering with the wine industry, again, you're getting more data from soil samples, from drones. How do you see machine learning impacting the wine industry?
You want that?
Is the answer not yet?
Well, I'm not sure if I know what team learning means.
No, machine
Oh,
learning.
machine learning.
Machine learning.
Machine learning?
Yeah, you train an AI engine. You train the machine
Right.
with lots of data along a certain
I
line.
think that's
I
really
have a response.
Okay,
if
please.
I
It's a
may.
it's a good question.
We haven't had in this industry typically, and David may be able to correct me because he may run a larger organization. We haven't had, or we haven't viewed staff budgets as sufficient to support the kind of hires, whether they be engineers or MBAs, to do data analysis and to develop the algorithms that would be required to create computer programs that can learn this, from all the data that's available. And it's only recently that I'm beginning to bump into young people right out of college or out of graduate school who are working here in this industry in meaningful positions. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that side of this industry because I think it's way underdeveloped.
Well, here's a cheap way to do it. Hire interns from Rensselaer Polytechnic, and they'll get it done for you. One last question. Anyone in the back?
Ed's got one.
So the fires were in 2017. If you're making reds, you're probably bottling this fall or next spring. What can we expect from a taste in the red wine that was harvested in 2017?
Gotcha. So you have to consider that this is Napa Valley, and people expect the very, very best from here. The bar is very, very high. Those that did experience smoke taint issues and whatnot, I think you have to have the confidence in the winery, in the producer, that they did the right thing, that those lots are held back and held aside. And they may have they may have been sold off to something else, that if you're gonna pick up a $5 bottle of wine, you're not even gonna notice it. It's moved off into that category. And I think you just have to have the confidence that here in Napa, we have done that, made those decisions, those tough calls. And to keep in mind, 90% of the fruit in Napa was harvested before the 17 fire. That's a lot. Now 10% is also a lot also. But I think that's where the confidence level comes in. And on a side note, there are other varieties that came in way before. Not only Cabernet, but Zinfandel is one of those varieties that just matures soon, early in the season. And so all of ours came in, except for one in Sonoma, and that went into a different category. We sold it off. It's that confidence level. I think you just have to have that.
So
And I think that is a good note to end on, because I think what you're seeing here are three individuals who, A, really know their business. B, I think there are lessons to be learned from and to Silicon Valley in the sense of dealing with complexities and complexities that you cannot always control. Then I believe that we've heard inklings of where some of the modern analytical techniques might be able to play a role. It may not have gotten down to the full molecular or genomic levels, but there are those things. But this whole issue of risk-taking that Silicon Valley prides itself on, but risk-taking where the reward is expected a lot quicker than you may find it in this business, I think is a lesson that all of us can take away, as well as we can teach our students to that. I'm thinking about the gentleman in the back who raised the question in the medical arena, because in some ways those complexities are there as well, and the payoffs are not overnight. The fact that we call Silicon Valley has to do with the things that have come largely started with the hardware, the hardcore, but come out of software. But there's a large and long-term investment in what undergirds what Silicon Valley plays on. And so I think that is how it links here. But it also shows that creativity and inherent understanding is very important in this business, but so is it in other lines of business. Let us thank these remarkable individuals.